Hello and welcome to our roundtable webinar, How to Evaluate Cloud Migration Milestones. I'm Cheryl Rasmussen and I'm the Customer Marketing Manager here at Tugboat Logic. I'll be the moderator for this presentation today. During the presentation, we invite you to leave us questions or comments, but please know we'll address them at the end of the discussion. We've also left a handout courtesy of our panelists today. You should be able to find it in your interface on the side. So without further ado, I will introduce you to our four speakers. So we have Steve Genders, Alfredo Pardo, Nick Beretta, and Chris Pedigo. Steve, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Sure, thank you, Cheryl. My name is Steve Genders, as she said, VP of Information Systems and Security at Thentia. Been with Thentia since about August. They're a smaller SaaS vendor providing a foundation for evolving government agencies back in front of house processes. Before that, I was on the other side. I worked in financial services. I led a team of cloud security risk assessors. We helped the bank I worked at assess and plan for approximately 400 vendors in our time there. Before that, I'm not going to go any further back because then you'll figure out how old I am.
Awesome. I'll just go who's next to me here. Chris, could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Hey everyone, I'm Chris Pedigo. I am Laceworks Field CTO. I actually run our office of the CTO, doing things like competitive intelligence and field CTO work, which is essentially showing up to meetings like this, talking about the industry and lacework in general, really being the voice of the customer and understanding trends in the market. Previous to this, I spent a couple of years doing cloud consulting, where I was doing cloud migrations for some big companies you've probably heard of. And previous to that, I worked for a competitor to AWS back when that wasn't a joke.
All right, amazing. Next on here is Alfredo. You're next on my list here.
Hi everyone, my name is Alfredo Pardo. I joined the Kalen team last November as Security and Compliance Practice Lead. My previous experience was as a cloud security architect and DevSecOps. I have over 16 years in the industry, and I want to thank you all for having me here.
Thanks, Alfredo. And last but definitely not least, Nick, could you tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Nick Beretta. I am Principal Solutions Architect at CloudKnox, which is a startup focusing on helping customers gain visibility into the permissions gap in their cloud environments and dynamically right-size those permissions for least privilege. So basically helping you find what are the unused privileges in your environment that are assigned to users and giving you controls to minimize that and right-size by taking the unused privileges away. So prior to joining the company last November, I was a senior solutions architect at AWS Canada for 2 years. And then prior to that, I spent 5 years at Google, the last 2 as a customer engineer for Google Cloud. So in the roles I've had, in the market I've had, I worked with a lot of customers, in particular large customers who are starting their cloud journey or just starting to build out their foundational cloud strategy and foundational environment. And I worked with them on both the AWS and Google side and informing them on best practices, not just the technical architectures they have to consider and technical components, but also some of the organizational things to consider, how to organize their teams, how to optimize their processes. So I'm really excited to be on the panel with Alfredo, Chris, and Steve today, with Cheryl moderating, and looking forward to the chat.
All right, thank you everyone. It's great to have you here. So we'll go over what we're going to cover today. So essentially we're going to be covering themes on vendor selection, onboarding, how to simplify the process, security and compliance considerations, how to manage high risk permissions, and the right balance between too much and too little due diligence. So we'll start with the vendor selection process. So in terms of this theme, do you feel like your vendor selection process is fairly static or more dynamic, and why? Chris, why don't you start us off here?
So vendor selection, this is something very near and dear to my heart. I have spent several years on both sides of this challenge, and what I've seen most often is the companies that are using a static vendor selection process where they have an RFP that goes out. Generally, they're sending out data that's really outdated. And if you really know the technology for the RFP, you read and you sometimes will laugh at how bad the questions are, because they really don't address the actual challenges that the customer is looking to solve. And often, I really understand, nobody has a professional RFP writing arm And so it's generally a copy of a doc from another company 3 years ago that they're trying to use to fit into their process. And I think the real challenge is people don't know what they don't know. So they're trying to use someone else's work to help guide it. And so when you really have these static processes in place, you have a list of questions and 25 vendors send in their answers and you pick the best one or two from there. While as if you were to talk to each of those vendors, they would spend time, hopefully if they're a good vendor or a good partner, they're going to spend time educating you on the market to help you understand kind of what you should care about. Now, obviously you have to take every vendor's conversation with a grain of salt because they want to sell you theirs. But if you take the meta analysis of all of them, it should help drive your RFP process.
Sure. Steve, do you have anything to add to that?
Oh, I have to say I didn't get to have as much fun with the RFP process, but I certainly understand what Chris was talking about. Typically at the bank where I did a more comprehensive assessment, I usually had more time because the bank has a lower risk tolerance. We had a dynamic questionnaire that typically started with a short list, and then we'd dig deeper. We'd have a more of an interview approach. Reflecting on how I do it now, I'm in a much smaller organization, very different risk tolerance. I tend to go out there and ask for the artifacts that I hope they create, the SOC 2, the pen test, and that kind of thing. And I look that over to try to find those indicators that maybe lead me to a couple additional questions. But I don't have the time, so I tend to just send out ad hoc questions based on my experience and their product.
Alfredo, do you want to weigh in?
Sure. Yeah. In addition to that questionnaire they initially sent, it is important to know how is the service your vendor provides. Do they have enough support for the service they provide? Is the company solid enough to make sure you will be receiving support in the future? Do they have a straightforward implementation process? That might be the things that I will also consider in this process.
And Nick, anything else to add?
Sure. So Alfredo, Chris, and Steve probably collectively have more experience on the vendor selection side than I do. But I have a similar background to Chris somewhat in terms of the kind of working at the vendor or working for the company that's vying for the business or going through the RFP process. I would say I agree a lot with the things that are being raised to get from your vendor, potential vendor. So the compliance reports, the SOC 2, the pen test, questions about the company's future. Especially if you're working with a company that's earlier stage, it's reasonable to ask questions like, what's your support model like? What's your partner ecosystem like? What are some details about, the company's future, fundraising, financials? Like, you definitely want to make sure that you're investing in a company that's going to be there to support you in the long term. I think a lot of those are table stakes. So beyond that, where you'd want to go with your vendor selection is, the new process now for working, with vendors and choosing vendors, like you have a lot more information available to you that has been democratized just by what you can get from a Google search, what you can get from talking to your colleagues at other companies, your peers at other companies, and vendors realize that, and good vendors who are focused on that customer experience and who are focused on making sure that the customer is gaining long-term value from the relationship will recognize that and will try to proactively provide that to you. So if you hear a pitch from a vendor, if you're in a discussion with a vendor, be wary of things like them saying we're the biggest, we're the best, we have the most X, we have the most Y. Look instead for things like them referencing customers. They don't have to reference the customer's name in the first meeting. Likely you can line up a reference call with a customer that they can do under NDA, but look for them to explain that this is how our customers use our solution. This is how our customers use our platform. This is how we're providing value to our customers. It's going to give you a lot more real world perspective on what problem the vendor is solving and their relationship they're maintaining with their customers. And ask them, how long has that customer been a customer? How many customers do you have in this segment? Those are all fair questions to ask. Obviously, you don't want to just be the follower. You don't want to just base your whole decision on that. But I do find, and I've heard this from my counterparts at customers I've worked with, that's given them a lot of useful insight in addition to the typical kind of static RFP process. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And on top of that, I think it's a little bit telling for a vendor how long it takes you to come up with a customer reference. Now, maybe for your specific industry, it might be hard if you do something that's like not their core, but like if they can't provide, 2 or 3 good references for you within a week, and at least like maybe you have challenges scheduling, but at least here's the people they're willing to talk to you. I think that that's a little bit telling too.
100%. Yeah. Any company that's been around for about a year in the market at that point with a viable solution should have at least 1 or 2 customers they can put you in touch with at that point that they've operationalized.
Yeah.
All right. So what security pitfalls do you watch out for when evaluating vendors? Steve, why don't you start off on this one?
I tend to look for those indicators, as I said in the report, that show that they have achieved a certain state of maturity. That can often lead me into questions that I feed back to the business interested in the product, and I help them understand, hey, we might be getting into a relationship here with somebody who's fairly new to this problem space, right? They might not care as much about security. They're more inclined to try to gain customers, and they're building for that. So are they going to be the right solution? I get to turn back questions like that.
For sure. Chris, do you want to add to that?
So I think that misconfigurations and pitfalls are like really one of the biggest challenges of your first step towards the cloud, and understanding configurations and misconfigurations is an entire program. I don't really consider it security per se. It may help drive you being secure by making sure you don't have those misconfigurations, but it in itself isn't really security. It's more of a compliance and policy. Security is ensuring that things are operating securely. I mean, I guess it's a pretty big subject and a whole can of worms, but I think that best practices are good, but only good if you as an organization aggressively enforce them. Like, it's fine to have a policy, compliance or otherwise about not having open S3 buckets, but if you're not doing your due diligence and aggressively solving those problems when they happen, like, that compliance really means nothing. So I think that that's one of the big challenges there. And when partnering with a vendor for security compliance, like, this is actually an interesting thing too, because the reason a lot of these compliance standards exist is like the reason you ask your vendor for like a SOC 2 compliance standard or an ISO or something like that is because you want to be sure of their compliance. But what I often see is people ask questions in addition to what's in the SOC 2, but oftentimes the questions overlap. So I think having a mature understanding of how to assess vendors is something that's really important. Understand what a SOC 2 means, and then what you need to know in addition to that to be secure. And so that's kind of where I think everything really meets together with vendor evaluations and with your own programs.
Yeah. Nick, anything else to weigh in on there?
Yeah, to build on what Chris was saying a little bit, one thing I'll add, and this also builds a little bit, I think, of what Steve was saying as well. You're a lot more intertwined with your partners in general in the cloud era than you were in the past when you'd buy a software solution from a company, you'd deploy it on premises, you'd manage it. You might get updates, you might have a contract for support and service from the vendor, but it lived in your environment, you controlled it. It was enforced to your standards. It was just another citizen in your ecosystem. With the cloud, for example, in AWS, you might be consuming, and this isn't exclusive to AWS, this could be on Google or Azure as well. You might be consuming, a Snowflake type product or something that runs, in a cloud that's managed by the vendor, or they broker direct access to the VPC, the virtual network, something like that. And so you're sending data over that direct link to the vendor's cloud environment. So with that being said, once you exfiltrate data, even if it's something that you control, even if it's something that you're choosing to do, like, that data is now in the hands of the vendor. So you should understand specifically when it comes to their configuration, how are they configuring their environment? How are they enforcing guardrails? What frameworks are they compliant with that can they attest to? But also, what data are they collecting from my environment? Right? So if they're not collecting any data from me, if none of my data is actually leaving my environment, then it's one thing. But if they're taking in data, whether it's log data or user data or anything like that, the vendor should be able to attest to what they're doing with that data, where they're maintaining it, what their life cycle is, for how long they're persisting that data, what they're using it for, what they're doing when they're done with it. And that is stuff that is largely covered in the kind of compliance assets you would ask for, but they're all educated questions to ask. And it's okay to ask that, and a vendor should be able to answer those clearly, authoritatively, and honestly.
And Alfredo, anything else to add to this?
Yeah, sure. So I agree that data breaches are today the most common things occurring due to misconfigurations. So if your vendor is providing infrastructure as a service or platform as a service, you may want to understand how they are configuring and learn the security features of every of these resources. And if you are relying on software as a service, you may also want to deep dive into your vendor's architecture to understand how they are managing your data, and also see if they are going through any kind of security assessment or penetration testing with any major change in the application.
And just one more thing to add to what Alfredo was saying too. You can also get a little bit of this from asking what types of customers in certain highly regulated industries like financial services, healthcare, government, the vendor has. It's not necessarily a 100% indicator, but it is some circumstantial evidence that that the vendor may have built certain security controls to satisfy those highly regulatory enforced environments. And it's kind of the saying, the rising tide lifts all the boats. So if you can satisfy those really kind of security conscious spaces, customers in those spaces, and there's a good chance that you've built kind of general practices that will apply to all customers, just as another data point you can ask for when you're doing your evaluations.
Yeah.
Perfect. Do you think that continuous assessment programs also are something that you should consider asking about? Because the point-in-time assessment is good, but if I know the auditor's coming in, I'm going to do my little bit extra due diligence to make sure I pass all the checks that I know they're going to ask for. But if you're continuously monitoring, so as misconfigurations come up and you have proof of resolution, I think that that's a more mature program. So if you ask and they have a good answer for it, you're in a great place. If you ask and they don't, maybe it's time to dive a little deeper into how they're making sure they don't have that open S3 bucket.
All right, thank you, everyone. So what to prepare? So during the preparation process, what questions should you ask internally? Alfredo, can you start this one off?
Sure. So first, you may want that your team is aware of cloud technologies, so you can have a transparent picture of how the vendor is implementing security configuration. Additionally, you may want to have a security strategy with, clear milestones, well-organized timelines, people accountable for completion of tasks, and also expected outcomes defined, right?
Yeah, Steve, anything to add?
Yeah, definitely agree with Alfredo and echo what he said. It starts with an understanding of the data flow, figuring out what the timelines are, the pressures that are pushing to move towards the vendor, laying down and having sort of a clear path to how you're going to get to end of job, and assessing the vendor, figuring out their architecture, their solution, where you need to integrate, what you need to build on as a compensating control possibly to mitigate risk in their process or product.
Oh, Chris, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, I think that some of the things also to think of is you want to make sure your assessment program isn't too heavy, because you will get stuck in this little paralysis by analysis program if you're trying to go too deep and answer too many questions. So there is due diligence, and then there's like you're doing too much diligence, I think is the way to think about it. But this is why like compliance standards are there. Like if they have FedRAMP, you could be pretty sure that everything is good. Most companies don't have FedRAMP, so you can go from after that. But also understanding the scope of data is very important. Like if they're going to collect your PHI or PII data, you have to start looking at things like GDPR compliance or maybe HIPAA compliance, depending on what the data is, where it's coming from. You need to understand if they're collecting metadata or actual data about your services. Those are pretty big differences, and the amount of controls are there. And then the other part of it is you need to understand what is the risk of a breach of the third-party service. So if somebody gets access to the data that they're collecting, what is the material risk to you as a company? And that should help you decide like what level of due diligence you need to do, what sort of questions you should ask, what's in your legal contract. And finally, I think you do really need to make sure that someone who's going to understand the answers like properly is on the call, because oftentimes I'll be on calls and like someone who's from legal or marketing is asking a deeply technical question and I'll give an answer and they don't really understand it. Some people do, some people don't. It depends on their domain knowledge. And like then that comes into explaining 3 or 4 or 5 times, and they like inherently you're going to trust someone at your company better than someone externally. So you really need to make sure you have the right people on the right due diligence calls so that they can say, that's a risk I accept, that's a risk I don't accept, versus, just having someone who's kind of a generalist try to answer those questions.
Yeah. Nick, can you speak to any of those points?
Yeah, so I'll echo what Chris, Alfredo, and Steve have all said. I think they're all great points and 100% what kinds of questions you should be asking. One thing I'll add, and this is something that you should ask pretty early on, ideally in your cloud adoption or the start of the execution or formulation of your cloud strategy within an organization. That said, it's never too late. But you should ask, is our organization ready to deploy and manage these services in a cloud-first type environment? And so by that, I mean, evaluate your existing processes, evaluate your existing organization structure. If you've got a centralized IT team, you're going out and you're purchasing, something like, a managed data warehouse like a Snowflake, or you're buying a tool that's meant to be put in the hands of, decentralized teams that are managing their own cloud environments under the guise and the watch of the central cloud team. So ask yourself if your existing processes support that and support the organization's ability to deploy that without slowing down the company or taking agility away from the developers, which is one of the drivers of why customers go to cloud in the first place, why businesses go to cloud in the first place. But also if you can still do that safely in that kind of environment. So try to find a balance between securing the environment, but look at securing by guardrails and putting effective limits on what people can do with the tools you buy and the processes you put around them, versus looking to enforce compliance by centralization. Because what you'll find is that you'll just become a bottleneck for everything. You'll end up slowing kind of the overall adoption and use of the services down across the board. And that takes one of the big value adds of adopting cloud services and taking a cloud strategy for your organization off the table.
Yeah. If I could build on that, Nick, one of the things that I saw more than a few times when I was at the bank was a smaller kind of SaaS nimble vendor who was fairly technical in the interviews and the conversations around how they were protecting our data in their environment or in their AWS environment or whatever. But when you started digging into some of the linked capabilities, the cloud capabilities that these companies would use for monitoring or security or whatever, they didn't always have as mature of a story there. So echoing what you said, if they're not ready to adopt cloud as an cloud first mindset and think about it end to end, they're really maybe not ready.
Yeah, and I'm really glad, Steve, that you mentioned that, because the best vendor should also be able to guide you through your end of the shared responsibility, right? Everything in cloud, whether you're dealing with AWS or you're dealing with a partner in the space, you'll hear the term shared responsibility model really often, almost ad nauseum, but there's a reason you hear it so often. Like on AWS, for example, if you're partnering with AWS as your cloud provider, they're going to tell you, look, we're going to do security of the cloud itself. We'll secure everything from the physical operation all the way up through the hypervisor running on our infrastructure. And if you're using a managed service on top of that, we'll also secure the layers of the service that we're covering. But you're responsible, customer, for your configuration, meaning if you make an S3 bucket public, which isn't by default, like you have to explicitly do that, or if you grant a role, or if you grant permissions to some entity that gives it basically power user or admin access to your entire environment, when you don't need that, when you could have gone through a least privileged approach, like that is the customer's responsibility. I think that's more well understood now in the wake of some of the higher profile breaches that have happened, but it's still something that it should be front of your mind all the time when you're working, is your vendor has a responsibility to secure the pieces they're providing that they control, but it is a partnership. The best vendors will help you understand how you can effectively maintain your end of the partnership. And that'll be based on experience with their other customers and best practice and operational tools they've built out to help, whether it's deployment templates, scripts, best practices guides, permissions templates, whatever they might have.
Well said.
Thank you.
Yeah, the easiest analogy to describe that is the cloud is responsible for giving you a car that can be secured if you lock the doors. But if you take your car, park it in an airport parking lot, and don't lock the doors, and someone comes by and breaks in, like, that's your fault, not the car maker's fault. And that's essentially what the cloud is like. Like, we give you the capability. It's up to you to make sure that, like, you do your due diligence.
Yeah. So in a similar sense, what questions should you ask externally? So to your third-party vendors, cloud service providers, people like that.
I'll say one thing here, because we did kind of, I think, mix a little bit the internal and external questions on the last slide. But that said, if your vendor is charging you for single sign-on integration, give them some feedback. They shouldn't do that. SSO integration is kind of a key foundational piece for any tool to integrate in your environment. If you're charging extra for it, basically what you're saying is, okay, customer, if you don't pay me for SSO integration, then you're gonna have to maintain a whole separate set of credentials, a whole separate set of usernames and passwords that you then have to manage the entitlements for. And I'm not gonna give you the ability to integrate with your existing identity source of truth unless you pay me extra. Just some feedback there. I think that's something that we as a space, I'm talking customers and vendors, should make that something that's table stakes.
Alfredo, to add? Oh, sorry, you were about to say.
I was just going to say, I think some of the things you really need to understand from a security vendor is where are they hosted, how are they hosted, what sort of compliance standards do they have, how do they think about security. Again, depending on the data they collect, you need to understand if they collect data that could be considered PHI data, will they sign a DPA or something like that to, accept the responsibility. Understand what their least privilege stance is, and how do they go about providing evidence. Some other things that are generally pretty common are pen testing, things like that. Like, the answer really should be like, what are you doing to make sure that my data is secure? And in the case that you were breached for one of your customers, the blast radius is not all of your customers. And in the light of solar winds and all of that, you should really ask, hey, what are you doing to ensure that you won't be the next solar winds causing me to get hacked? So I think these are some of the things. Whatever the most topical recent security hack is, there should be an answer on everybody's mind about that. So, asking pretty directly, I think, is a pretty solid way to understand if they're even considering security, if they're paying attention to the news and understanding how it could affect them and how that downstream effect could affect you as a customer of theirs.
Yeah, Chris, I would add, I don't know if you're picking on security vendors on purpose or not, but their threat model is certainly very different than someone who actually handles PII for a living. So yeah, it's definitely worth digging in there for sure. I'd also add to what Nick said, I would add multi-factor and log export to those minimum bar requirements.
Absolutely.
That's a real problem, right? If you can't integrate with the security program, you're only going to be locked into small companies and small projects with small budgets, right? If you want to get to a broader use of your product, you really got to make it easy on security.
Yeah, they have a point there. And additionally to protecting your data in transit and at rest, you may want also to check how they protect the data in use. I mean, if you receive an attack, how they are using the data in memory, for example, and how often they go through security assessments. And yeah, you want to know how serious are they regarding their security evaluation.
I think we didn't really hit that last bullet, actually, right? One of the things with the onboarding team, definitely try to figure out how complex that integration is going to be and how much work that will take, right? Yeah. Figure out for yourself, are you going to have to rotate keys? rotate passwords for service IDs, anything like that to make that integration safe and secure.
Yeah. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
That's a really great point too. Like the field is, there's just vendor after vendor, products were bought and never deployed. Almost, it doesn't matter what it was. So if you don't have a good integration, if you don't have a good integration management, if you don't have a good process for deploying the product, getting up and functional, getting training done, becoming successful. Like if you're buying a product, like you're buying it for its value, and you're not going to get value if it's not deployed and widely adopted. And if it takes a year to get a deployment done, like that's an entire year of your contract that is just getting the product up and functional. So having a well thought out plan that they can deliver and share with the team of how do we get your product deployed, how do we get this service deployed is super important too.
Yeah, I'd add to that. And thanks, Steve, for raising it. You know, the other side of it too is how extensible is the product. So to build on what Chris said, you know, for example, if you're buying a cloud security tool, odds are that tool is not going to exist in a vacuum. It's probably going to have reasonable integrations with things like your ITSM, like ServiceNow, or your SIM, like a Splunk or Sumo Logic. So how extensible is the API? How well maintained is the API? What pre-built integrations exist, so I don't have to build a bespoke integration? What does the, you know, what resources does the company have both in-house and in its partner ecosystem for help with those integrations? And just get an understanding of what that looks like. Odds are the less extensible the platform is, the less likely it is to have long-term value in your environment, because you've got all these heterogeneous pieces coming together to form your cloud ecosystem. But ask those kinds of questions as well, and then ask the requisite security questions on that. How's the API implemented? What's the auth like for those API endpoints? Is it, you know, is it OAuth based? Do I have a JWT? Do I have to use like basic auth? Hopefully not. But just ask those kinds of questions and get a sense of how extensible the product is that you're putting into your environment.
Nick, you just triggered a thought for me. One of the other things I look for, it's maybe a rare thing to look for, but how convenient it is for me to contribute a feature request. Can I directly get in, follow that feature request, or do I have to go through sales or support to do that, right? People who want their feedback, the design thinking from their customers, open that door.
Oh yeah.
I was just thinking roadmap, understanding what they're building, what's their plans for the next 6 months to a year. It's also important. So we're like of the same mind in that thought process there.
Yeah,
it's really important to know where you're going and to make sure that this partner has the same vision of the future as you have.
And this is where your relationship with your solutions architect, your technical counterpart on the vendor side, will come in really handy. So a vendor, you know, in general, the vendor should be deriving 90 to 95% of their feature requests from customer feedback. And it should be coming directly from the field. Your technical field team, so your sales engineer, your solutions architect, should be interfacing directly with product and engineering on a regular basis. Now, obviously, in larger companies, you know, maybe that, you know, the expectations are managed a little bit, but, you know, at both AWS and at CloudKnox, that's how it operates. So the SAs are kind of the voice of the field, and we advocate for the requests. The architect of the SE will let you know, kind of be realistic and manage your expectations. Like, it's based on an aggregate of what the field is asking for, but you should be able to get that visibility, and you have a right to ask for that and ask for updates, because it's how you're going to use the product. It's how you're going to get long-term value out of it. So I echo what Chris and Steve said there as well. It's a great thing to bring up.
A good conversation there. Thanks, everyone. So do you capture a detailed process or highlight general steps when you're doing this? The onboarding process.
Well, I can start on that. Probably when you are thinking about migration, you won't be able to migrate everything at once. You may want to select those most innovative projects first, probably, and have your team learning the cloud technologies. And once they feel comfortable, start little by little migrating the rest of the services or products. So probably one good idea might be selecting those cloud native friendly projects first. And once you have your first line of defense ready, start moving iteratively the rest of the projects.
Steve, can you speak to that at all?
So he's talking, I think, about onboarding your existing vendors as well as future ones, right? I've got that similar problem. I'm very fresh in the position here at Thentia, and we've obviously been using vendors for a while. So completely agree with your points, Alfredo. It's got to be prioritized by risk. You got to figure out what is most important, returning the most value. You got to also get to the deepest worries, though, pretty quickly too. So you know, it takes some prioritization, some influence, some votes from the team to figure that out. The interesting one to touch on here, the bullet about accountability. As a smaller firm, our project plans tend to be a lot more fluid and relaxed and less organized, let's call it, than the big entity that I came from, of course. Getting to a core, you know, leanest process is one of my main goals, and trying to turn that into our product, actually. So that's one of the areas where we've really enjoyed working with Tugboat Logic as well. They've got some great automation in their system, so helps me keep that accountability.
Thanks, Steve. Chris, anything else to add?
I think this goes a little bit back to some of the things I was saying on the last slide. Your implementation plans. I'm a big fan of checklists. I once read the checklist manifesto. I believe it's really great to make sure that you don't miss out on the little things. It's really hard to maintain all of the details for all of the projects you're running at once. And so if you can get down to, okay, our vendor onboarding, here's all the checklists. We have to have good answers for these questions. Here's the optional nice to have. And understanding that, and then when you're looking at your implementation program, kind of the same way, understanding delivery times, project plans, schedules. It's not the sexy work that anyone wants to say that they do, but it is what makes a successful relationship with any third-party vendor you buy. I've been at a company where we bought 2 knowledge management solutions. The first one, nobody ever adopted because we didn't have a solid implementation plan. The second one took a team of 3 people putting together all of their time and work to implement it. And now it's like really starting to roll out and we're seeing the effects of it. So kind of having that plan, going all in and not just like dipping your toes in the water is super important. So I really think every vendor should have a pretty standard checklist. Here's the questions that we must have asked, and you know, maybe different segments. Is this a security product? Is this you know, like whatever source it is, maybe you have custom checks for that to ask those questions to make sure that your minimum is done. But then your deployment plan is just as important as your, you know, due diligence and the purchase of the product. And that accountability is key. If you don't have buy-in from the top down, you're probably not going to have a very successful deployment of a new product.
Yeah.
And any final thoughts?
Yeah, so I'll add one thing on the accountability piece. So remember that, you know, you're working on a partnership with your vendor, and especially, you know, with kind of cloud technologies and the reliance on integrations, you know, holding yourself accountable, it also gives your vendor confidence in the work they're doing with you, that the work they're generating for you has value, the things they're giving you have value. And a lot of people, I think, sometimes seem to think like they have this stereotype that my vendor only cares about, you know, the ones who are spending the most money. Some vendors, that's certainly true, but at least, you know, when I worked for AWS, you know, or I work at CloudKnox, you know, where you tend to spend time is with the customers who are upholding their end of the bargain from an accountability piece, right? So you say we're going to follow through on this, we're going to have a weekly cadence, and we're looking to have this deployed by, you know, this date. And the vendor is going to come through for you with all the things you need: the checklist, the deployment assets, templates, anything you need for your due diligence. And I'll touch on that in a moment. So try to stick to that too, you know, and try to help your vendor out by kind of holding up that end of the accountability. Obviously, things happen, things slip, priorities get shifted, but you'll develop a really strong relationship with your vendor if it's a two-way street, and you know the vendor is coming through on requests for you, giving you what you need, adapting to what you need, giving you visibility, things like feature requests, deployment resources, but you're also following through on the things you state to the vendor to the best of your ability. The second thing I want to say is just on the due diligence side, and it probably goes back to something we talked about a couple slides ago, but be reasonable about what you're asking your vendor for in terms of thinking about the implications of them sharing a certain thing with you. So it's totally reasonable to ask for a pen test attestation or to ask for a high-level executive summary of how the organization did in a pen test. It is not reasonable, and in fact, you should never go with a vendor that would willingly share with you their detailed pen test report, because that's typically under NDA between the organization that did the test and the organization that commissioned the test. If they leak that to you, that means anything that was found in that test in detail is now out there in the world. So it's reasonable for a vendor to not want to share that detailed pen test report with you. The other thing, and this comes up when you're choosing your cloud partner providers, if you're choosing between like an AWS, a GCP, and Azure or the like, don't expect that they're going to let you do a walking tour of a data center. The vendors in general, officially, they don't even publicize the locations of them. And think about the implications, right? Imagine if access to these is very tightly controlled. Badged employees at AWS didn't actually have access to our data centers or even really like have any direct access to anyone who was working in them. And that's by design. So remember, like, we're supporting multiple customers with a lot of these products, and introducing someone who wants to do their own walkthrough or their own check for their own due diligence introduces risk for those other customers as well. So when a vendor pushes back on something like that, understand that that's the basis for it, that they're balancing the needs of the entire customer base in that response.
Yeah, if you're sharing a pen test report that isn't full of redacted, you're probably doing it wrong as a company. Redacted is it's pretty standard. You don't want people to know. But then again, if your pen test report has any findings above maybe a low or a medium here or there that's hard to exploit, like, that's probably someone you also shouldn't partner with. So if it's a clean bill of health, maybe you're okay. I think what you mentioned about the Amazon, like your cloud data centers, like, you can find any compliance standard about everything they do in their data centers. Like, Amazon has a website for it, everyone does. So you can just go get the docs. So I think you could feel pretty confident in their level. And this is where the shared security model really does come in. Like, everything up to the car is secure. It's your duty to lock the doors. So you just understanding that, understanding where to go to get the different pieces of data for the security is interesting.
Chris, can I ask a follow-on question?
Sure.
So when I think about the larger entities like that, I've kind of felt a theme going through here where, generally we seem to be agreeing mostly that a larger entity is probably going to be more mature, and probably they're going to treat us better as customers. They're going to enable us better as customers. Do you consider that when you're spending the time to review their SOC 2, for example? Would you spend the same amount of time on an AWS SOC 2 as you would, I don't want to name names, but a smaller SaaS provider?
So I think that the way I think about it, there's two pieces to what's going on, right? Like, AWS is a hosting provider, and so they're going to do one set of things. I would look at whatever their highest security standard is first. So for example, AWS, like, in each data center that you would consider using has a book of 20 standards, right? So would I spend as much time on AWS's standard? No, but that's because this is their fundamental job. Now, if it was a medium to large company that hosted their own data centers, that's where I'd spend a little bit more time to make sure some of the controls were in place. And like I said, it's really where your data and infrastructure meet storage and encryption requirements that I care the most about, kind of like that next level up. And the time and due diligence I'm going to do is mostly going to be involved with the quality or type of data they're collecting. I'm a little bit less worried about certain data types, like being exposed, things people could guess. I'm not too worried about. But if it's anything business critical or there's fines associated, I'm definitely going to do more due diligence there. So I do, unfortunately, you do spend a little less time on the multi-billion-dollar security as their primary concern. Maybe a little bit of it is because I've spent a lot of time doing due diligence on cloud service providers in the past that I feel pretty confident. Now, if I'm assessing a third-party cloud that I haven't used a lot, like Oracle, I'd spend a little bit more time to make sure that their data centers meet what I care about. Same thing, IBM Cloud, Alibaba, things like this. Even honestly, like AWS China, I've spent like 0 time there, so I'm not entirely sure what the differences are. So I guess it's a little familiarity bias there. Salesforce, like I just take for granted that they're secure. Maybe I do my due diligence there, and maybe that's not fair, especially to the people trying to compete against them. But unfortunately, it's kind of the state of affairs. Like, I feel like even if I'm a large business, I'm probably a small business in the state of somebody hacked Salesforce. And what you're generally worried about is someone's hacking your users getting into Salesforce, as opposed to Salesforce being hacked and getting to your data. That's kind of how I think about it. That's how I view the risk.
Yeah, we're older, so the bias does tend to creep in, doesn't it?
Yeah.
All right, I think a lot of the points were touched on this following slide here, but if there's anything else to add, so what sort of things should you plan for your migration?
Oh yeah, we have touched on a lot of these.
Yeah, so we don't have to spend as much time on it because we've already discussed a lot of it, but are there any other elements that you should plan for when preparing for your migration? There's also the question of AWS and GCP and how it's different from SaaS and how. So maybe we'll skip to that one there and let Alfredo maybe take the lead on that one.
Yeah, probably I would like to consider some risks. Well, data leakage is one of the first one due to poor or faulty configuration, but additionally, we may have to think about financial risk. So when you are using a third-party service, you may want to think about how they are going to use your budget. You have some risk called denial of budget, denial of wallet, when you run out of budget and you don't have the service unavailable when they need it. And additionally, well, as I was mentioning previously, having your team trained in cloud technology is essential to avoid the cloud adoption to be fast.
Yeah. Steve, anything to add to
So
that?
I'll drill into that, the differences between. You can invest quite a bit of time in trying to learn a product and threat model it to some degree and figure out what you need. Sometimes you don't always get that chance. So that sometimes leads to a bias and a reason for choosing a more mature vendor ahead of time. It actually can save you time. That's what I want to drill into.
Points to add there?
Mostly, I actually wanted to talk a little bit about the planning for onboarding and just rehash some of the things we talked about, because I think it's important. Checklist for your vendor assessment, checklist for onboarding plan. Make sure you have full buy-in from everybody, top to bottom, bottoms up, top down. Make sure people understand the value the tool's providing, and that if you have any detractors, those conversations happen and are handled before you try and deploy the product. Some of the worst things I've seen are one person wanted one vendor, one person wanted another, and then you get a total turn off for the other person's team when that happens. So like, I think the political piece of onboarding is incredibly important. Everybody should have a say. If they're going to be using the product, then they're at an appropriate level to have a say. And everybody should then be on board, even if their decision wasn't picked. It's so important that if you're actually, like we're all in a business, and like if you're actually selecting a vendor to get that deployed and to get it used and to like figure out how to realize value, and like time is the essence. Like if you don't get it deployed in the first 3 months, right, like you've just lost a quarter of your contract. Usually SaaS vendor year contracts, but that's why all of this is so important, and it's hard and it's brutal, but somebody needs to own it. So
yeah, so I think Alfredo, Steve, and Chris all kind of touched on this in their answers too, and I'll just add to it the operationalization of the platform that you choose to add to your environment. So what keeps it from ending up on the shelf, not being used once you've paid for it? It's having that conversation with your vendor and internally. How are we going to operationalize this? Everything from integrations to training to provisioning access, to any processes that need to be updated. Those are all conversations that you should have internally, potentially with support from your vendor for reliance on best practices, potentially getting advice from a customer reference call. If you line that up to understand how they operationalize it, it's really critical that you understand that, because it's going to become a daily part of your environment and a regular citizen in the environment with all the other tools and products that you're using. The second thing I'll say, and this is really more specific to your hosting provider, so AWS, GCP, Azure, Oracle, whoever you might have. Going back to the operationalization of those environments specifically, this is where the internal process conversation comes into play. So if you're running a centralized IT team and you're thinking, okay, we're just going to do centralized IT in the cloud. Every team that does something in the cloud that needs a deployment, needs a VM deployed, needs a permission granted, needs some service turned on, they're just going to come to us and we're going to turn it on for them and we'll manage it all the way we manage it in the data center. Let me know how that goes, because what you're going to find really quickly is that you're going to you're quickly just on permissions, like just on managing permissions. You think about all the people now who have access to your environment, whereas in the on-prem data center world, it might be a handful of people who have access to rack and stack hardware and configure network switches and do all that stuff, install disks. Now it's everyone. Every developer now has the ability with an API call to spin up a server, create a database, launch an image, launch a machine from a snapshot, create a Lambda function with an execution role. And you want that, right? You want that because that speed, that agility, again, is one of the value drivers of going to cloud. But if you try to centrally manage that, your team alone, your central cloud team, your central IT team is going to spend all of their time just managing permissions. And what that team should be doing is serving the same function to your internal customers, the developers, business unit, product teams that are consuming cloud, as your AWS solutions architect or your GCP customer engineer serves to you, in building the primitives that the other parts of the business can take and build on top of to build higher level services. So just like AWS provides you EC2, Lambda, S3, and all these other services that you build on top of, you take them and you build them into higher level building blocks and build guardrails, basically effective envelopes that say, okay, this development team can access the environment. These are the things they can't do. These are the things that we absolutely don't let you do no matter what. You build that permissions boundary, that guardrail, that configuration management, and then you give them tools like a cloud infrastructure entitlements management tool like CloudKnox to give them the visibility to say, okay, these are all the users who have these permissions. What permissions do they need versus what they're actually using? Let's make sure that they only have the access they actually need. And that's one example. You apply the same thing to configuration management, resource governance, firewall rules, whatever you need. Don't be afraid to decentralize. There are tools that exist to let you build those guardrails in place. But if you try to centralize everything, you're just going to bottleneck everything. And what's going to happen is the company's going to throw its hands up and say, this cloud thing didn't work out. It's more expensive. It's slower. We're going to stick to on-prem. And honestly, you're doing yourself a disservice at that point. There's a lot of really great things you get from moving to the cloud and consuming those managed services that allow you to focus not on the undifferentiated stuff that the hyperscale cloud providers all do, but on the stuff that's really going to differentiate your business and the core value prop to your customers.
Yeah, on that subject, I think you need to make sure to invest in architecture, and that's not just like building your infrastructure, that's having someone who understands all the pieces and how they fit together. Otherwise, you do have cost overruns and things like that, at least when you're talking about the public cloud.
100%.
Okay. Thanks for weighing in, everyone. So we're going to move on to what to review and common mistakes to avoid. So what do you formally review before and after deployment? Let's get Chris to start that one.
So before deployment, you want to review the deployment plan. You want to review key stakeholders. You want to review project milestones. You want to make sure you have that checklist in place for what success looks like. You want everyone to go towards the same target of adoption, whatever that is. And then once you're deployed, you want those metrics, you want those adoption metrics. So you want to understand who's using the product, why. If there's groups of people who aren't using the products, you want to understand what their challenges are, because you need to break down those barriers and help them. So like when I look through it, those are the two pieces. Depending on what the product is, you need to understand and make sure that things are secure, that everything is as intended. With things like integrations with sensitive data, you need to do your then assessment to make sure like, hey, this does look appropriate. So a lot of it really, like the other part is driven by what you buy, but the first part is deployment plan.
Yeah. Steve, good to weigh in.
Yeah, so I'd add on to what Chris said. I mean, depending on your size, you probably won't even want to have an audit come in after the fact and look it over. because you can have yourself check on it, but you build a bias over time as you're looking at this product and looking at it. You tend to lose sight of things that are actually important, and you might miss something. So it always pays to have a second eye. I think we did highlight in there having, you know, security sign off. Legal should also be mentioned, right? A lot of times you'll learn something along the way as you're deploying, and you'll actually change your risk picture, and they would need to be involved or help you understand if you have coverage for that or if you need to add something on.
Great. Alfredo?
Yeah, just that, you know, you might want to have an initial questionnaire to cover overall questions and deep dive into some areas that you may need some more specifics. And yeah, for smaller companies, having an initial checklist would be enough. For larger companies, this can be an iterative process. So you have to approach that little by little, you know.
And
Yeah. One thing I can add is have a debrief post-deployment. I'm not going to call it a post-mortem because that just, it implies too much, like, you know, outage recovery or things like that, but have a debrief, ideally with your vendor, if you're happy to do that, and talk about what worked well, what didn't work so well, what were some of the areas you found challenges. It's very rare that even the most well-planned deployment isn't going to hit at least one hiccup, especially if you're doing a deployment that's more than just deploying a server and turning on a service. There's any kind of integration involved or any kind of moving parts that involve integrating with the environment. That does two things. It helps you identify gaps in your own onboarding and deployment process that you might be able to remediate for next time. And two, going back to that long-term relationship and partnership you're building with your vendor, it helps them understand the same thing on their side, so they can remediate and rectify going forward, whether they do a larger deployment with you in the future or they deploy for other customers. Just in general, it raises up everyone's execution level.
all right, we'll move on to common mistakes. So are there any common mistakes that you find in this process that you've seen in the past in your experiences?
Well, regarding that configuration management bullet, I think one common mistake is the set and forget approach. So you receive the initial setup and you forget about checking. So you may want to have an incident response plan, you know, be prepared for an attack because sooner or later that will happen. And that is a key point. Also, you know, adding a lack of understanding of your environment will be another thing that, you know, slows down cloud adoption and also slows down quick response to incidents.
Yeah. And the other one we have here is companies buy for a single feature versus the whole package. Can anybody speak on that one?
That's something I do run across a lot as a vendor. Oftentimes when you go into a purchasing mode, and especially if you have a more static instead of dynamic RFP process, you're really going to focus on, oh, we just want this one feature because this one feature is going to solve all of our problems. And that's really the only thing we need because we've done our assessment. And it turns out that oftentimes either that one feature isn't as important as you think, or maybe implementing or deploying that is a lot harder than any organization actually does. I think about this a lot in letting vendors do automatic remediations in your environment or automatic changes or fixes that aren't approved by your team, something that demos well, that shows well, but when it actually comes down to deploying and implementing at an organization at scale, be it a 50-person company or a 1,000-person company or even larger, it's almost impossible. So make sure that you truly understand what that one feature is and why it's important to you, but also understand what the counter arguments are so that you're not making decisions based on, you know, some talk that you saw at reInvent or something a while ago that seemed really great, but it's, you know, if you interview the guy who gave the talk like a year later, he's like, yeah, actually that was great, but it turns out we couldn't make it work. So understand the difference between must have, nice to have, and make sure that those features you do care about are really business value features, not demo features or flash features. Or what I like to talk about is like the magic Netflix future that every company is trying to get to. With, you know, anytime you read an engineering blog from Netflix, you're like, wow, this is great. But we've got to understand that they have a specific approach, scale, mind share, everything that is dead focused on this. And they'll even talk about things that they got wrong or that they've changed their opinions over time. And so it's make sure you're not buying too much into the vision of the future and you understand your real challenges. And even if this one feature is important, maybe these other 12 features kind of fit in and give you better overall coverage.
Thank you very much. And I'm just going to kind of move us on to the end here since we're almost out of time. So putting it all together in parting thoughts. So are there any final thoughts that you'd like to share concerning everything that we've talked about today? I'll just go around the room again. Steve, are there any final thoughts from you?
We've hit a bunch of great topics. I think the one I would highlight again is that due diligence needs to be balanced to the risk, right? A lot of companies still are using old questionnaires, old techniques, as Chris really highlighted at the beginning. That can be a huge waste of time with really little value. So,
Chris?
I'd like to thank everyone for joining and listening to me have opinions. I think this has been great. I will say, whenever you select your vendor, you're going to have a pretty personal process. There's a lot of egos involved, so make sure you're understanding that. Make sure you have full buy-in from everyone who's making the decision, and make sure that you understand what a successful deployment looks like, and then you have the criteria to make that happen. Otherwise, you're just going to have, a half-used, often forgotten tool out there that nobody knows about.
Yeah. Alfredo, any final parting thoughts from you?
Yeah, probably complementing all that we have been talking about with, in the vendor selection process, having appropriate onboarding, training, documentation, and support. That is essential.
And Nick, from you.
Yeah, I'll just say, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, if you're going to stall, if your adoption or your migration to cloud is going to stall anywhere, it's probably going to be for an operational or process reason, like an operational process needing to evolve or a structure change needing to happen, as opposed to some technology blocker that's going to hold you up. And that's especially true on the hosting provider migration, migrating out of your data centers into AWS, GCP, Azure, the like. So I just want to stress again, especially early on in your cloud adoption, take stock of your IT organization structure, how centralized it is, and figure out how can we decentralize some of this authority while also building guardrails and putting an envelope in place so that we don't give too much we don't make it too much the Wild West, but we still let people take advantage of the democratization of IT that a lot of these services afford. Think about that, be willing to work with your vendor and work with their customers to understand, how they've helped other customers get there, leverage the wealth of information and best practices that both the cloud providers and their customers put out in blogs and videos on GitHub, leverage that wealth of information and do your part to think about how our organization has to evolve from the processes and structure that we currently have, because that's going to be one of the critical success factors in, is your migration going to take 2 years or is your migration going to take 5 years and going on? So getting ahead of it now or starting to have that thought, if you haven't had it already, I think is a big contributor to success.
Yeah, so we are at time. I have a couple of questions here, but if anybody needs to jump off, totally understand. So thank you all for attending our session today. We'll be providing a recording of the presentation for your personal use. So a big thank you to all of our speakers for sharing their knowledge and expertise. I'll pose the questions to you here, and if you need to go, you need to go. So the first question I got here was, you mentioned that not including single sign-on was something that would be a red flag when choosing a vendor. Are there any other major red flags to look out for when choosing a vendor?
Yeah, I guess that one's probably directed at me. I said that. Yeah, I mean, all the things that we talked about in the vendor selection process, like doing your due diligence on their adherence to compliance standards and their own security standards, what data are they collecting from you and how are they processing it, what are they doing with it once they've used it, how are they retaining it, basically understanding how does your use of that vendor and their services and your provisioning of data to that vendor provide those services, what new risks does that expose you to that maybe you're not already exposed to yourself? The SSO thing, really, I just think charging for SSO functionality or MFA type functionality, it just leaves a bad taste in my mouth because I feel like that functionality is really critical to an enterprise's overall security strategy. Like having a single identity source of truth that you're using for your entire control plane of services is just something you should be doing from an organizational best practice. Charging more for it, to me, it feels like charging for water, like charging for tap water, right? Like if someone walks into your store and says they're thirsty and you say, actually, you can have a cup of water, but it's 25 cents. I don't know, I've worked with customers who were in the vendor selection process who have thrown out vendors just by virtue of the fact that they charge for SSO. And so I've kind of seen on the other side, but it's just my opinion, right? I understand there's business reasons behind every decision. I just think that's something that we as an industry should offer as a standard.
No, I would actually build on that, Nick, because I'm with you. There are a lot of products that focus just on the direct and immediate customer, and they ignore all those operational lessons learned that we've been beating up on, right? A lot of implementations go bad because of IT problems or information security problems. If you're only aiming at that customer who uses your product for whatever business process and value that they get from it, but you don't think about the other part of the business that has to survive around them, you've really not shown that you understand your customers.
Yeah, 100% agree.
Yeah, I think my red flag I already mentioned. If your vendor can't provide references in a timely manner, that's a red flag to me. Probably the biggest red flag I could think of, because if they have a lot of customers and none of them are willing to get on a call, there's maybe a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
There is actually, sorry, one more thing I'll add to that, just because Chris triggered a thought, is you should be able to try the product. And you should be able to try the product and demo the features that are advertised or shown to you in the demo or shown to you on the slide. Like you should be able to validate that the product works and that the features that you've seen work as described once they're in your environment. And that POC should be something that's part of the process. If you have to buy the product to POC it or commit to a long-term licensing agreement to trial the product, that's a bad sign, in my opinion.
Yeah, there's also, does the product work at scale? Like some things work good in very small scope during your trial, so you need to understand what things look like at scale.
100%, yeah.
All right, thank you. The other question I have here is, in a smaller company, how should you approach this if you don't have a dedicated person or team that specializes in migrations?
Why Tugboat Logic? No. Need some guidance from somewhere, right? All jokes aside, you need some guidance from somewhere. There are plenty of vendors out there that can help you along the way if you cannot afford to have a full-timer. So I wouldn't suggest trying to do it yourself. You will get to that point of that SOC 2 and realize, oh, we've got actually a long way to go because we didn't really understand what we were doing. No harm, no foul. It's just the nature of the reality, right?
Yeah, to add to what Steve was saying, like partners. The partner ecosystems for all the major cloud providers and even the major SaaS and platform providers are massive, right? And so do your due diligence on the partners. Good partners will be able to manage it for you, provide the expertise, the guidance, and give you, basically make the project successful for you. The best partners will also up-level your own team's skill set along the way and teach as they build and put you in a position where you can take a more self-sufficient approach going forward. It's great to have a partner who can do the work for you, but if they don't do any enablement for you as well, then you run the risk of becoming tightly coupled to that partner for your long-term success of your organization's IT strategy, and that can introduce its own challenges down the line as well.
That's a big one.
I think there's something about adding into your selection criteria for these vendors, like ease of deployment and deployment plans. And some companies, like once you deploy, you have to buy professional services for training afterwards, understanding that whole piece to it. Also, you should trust your employees and empower them to run the project for you as long as all your due diligence is done. And like really the challenge, Lacework was a 25-person company when I joined. We're now 300 plus. Like things change a lot over time. So understanding that difference and understanding what you mean by small company and who can be assigned to this resource is really important. maybe it's someone who doesn't really make a lot of sense from their title or job role perspective is going to be in control of the rollout, but maybe they're just really effective at something. So understand your strengths as an organization and who you can delegate the work to be responsible and to keep things going and moving straight. And then again, it comes back to what I've mentioned several times: implementation plan, project plan, scheduling, and someone who can hold everybody in the room accountable.
All right, well, that concludes it for now. If there are any more questions, I'll make sure that they get to you. Otherwise, thank you all again for attending, and stay safe and healthy and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, everybody. Take care.